not. So I hope that you'll be patient and hear a good word and have communion with us. Kevin, normally you're not up here. Now I understand why. He's having way too much fun at my expense. Give the guy a break. He's been on vacation for a couple of weeks. I'm having to wiggle back in. All right, so anyway, I did plan the sermon to be short-esque, and so hear this good word from the Gospel of John. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. When you are already clean because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me, as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear fruit, much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up and thrown into the fire and burned. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. So this is a pretty typical kind of image Jesus uses throughout the Gospels about vineyards and vines and fruit. And then the whole idea of wine, right? I like wine.
Why are you so into...
You all know what my wife's favorite wine is? I want to live in Tuscany. All right, so... I know. And I even thought, yeah, it's probably not going to go over very well, but it was so tempting, I had to do it anyway. And that's kind of part of the problem, isn't it? We sometimes know better, but we do it anyway. And that's kind of the pruning process that we're talking about here. But the whole idea of wine and vines and branches, it's a big deal. It's not just only in the Gospels, but it's a part of human culture, human history. I came across a story that I'd never heard before. I don't know, at my age I thought I had heard it all, but I have not. And it's a story about Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. What happened on July 20th, 1969? Neil Armstrong had brought with him a little metal chalice and the host for communion to the moon. His church had given it to him. And while they were on the moon and before the moon walk, he was going to take communion, and he wanted to share what he was about to do on the radio, but he was encouraged not to because, remember Madeleine O'Hare, was it? She was already suing NASA for someone in the, orbiting the moon at Christmas read from the book of Genesis. So they encouraged Neil Armstrong to keep this hush and keep it quiet. So what he did is this instead. He says, what's about to take place is an amazing thing for all humanity. And why don't we just all have a moment of silence for anyone who is listening to, in your own way and in your own time, to give thanks for two astronauts who are now sitting on the surface of the moon. And so they went into radio silence. And while they were in radio silence, Neil Armstrong took the wafer and he ate. And he took the wine, which was in a small little tube, and he poured it into the little chalice. And the moon's gravity is 1/6 gravity. So he said that the wine just barely poured out, but just kind of circled around and collected in the little chalice. And then he drank. And after he and his partner had communion together on the moon, then he read the text. I am the vine, and you are the branches. What an amazing story, he said, that the first thing eaten on the moon was elements of communion. The first beverage consumed on the moon was communion wine. It's a big deal. What Jesus is talking about in this story is a big deal. It's inherent in who we are as human beings. Jesus took this very seriously. You remember his first miracle was at a wedding in Cana of Galilee, right? Where they ran out of wine, which is a huge faux pas for the host of the wedding reception. And these receptions went on for days. So it's not like they didn't plan well during the 5-hour period at the hotel reception area. No, these receptions went on for days, and they ran out, and Jesus turned water into wine. It's a big deal. And I want you to notice in the story that he says, I am the vine and you are the branches. And he said, and my Father is the gardener. The word Father is translated from a word Abba, which is a term of endearment. It means daddy. So a literal transition is daddy is the gardener. So I want you to hear that and to let that soak in, because I want you to see that as Jesus is teaching us this wonderful lesson, that God is not that some far-off spirit, essence, somewhere way out in the universe, who has no real connection with who we are as human beings. God is intimately involved in our lives. And so where there are branches that are producing no fruit, there is pruning, or there is cutting. Where branches that are producing fruit, there is pruning so that they will create more fruit. Now, as I was reading this story and preparing the sermon, a movie came to my mind immediately. It came out several years ago about two middle-aged guys who went to California wine country to have a vacation together, and all kinds of disasters follow. It's called Sideways. And they're at a point in the movie, Miles, the main character, meets Maya, and she's just curious, and she asks him, why are you so hung up on Pinot wines? What is it about them that you like so much? So watch this clip. To continue the metaphor, he's describing human beings, is he not, while he's describing the Pinot grapes? Sometimes we're thin, we're fragile. So we need coaxing. We need someone to pay constant attention to help us to fulfill our magnificence, right? And what's interesting, too, is after I saw this movie, I had never had a Pinot wine before, and that's kind of like what I drink most all the time now. Because I find that they are incredibly rich, full-bodied wines that are not like bitter, that they just, they're so smooth and but full of taste. They're fruity, but not like real sweet. I'm sorry. But I was kind of describing myself and you too, you know? Some of you are not too sweet, and some of you are a little fruity, but you're a perfect blend. You're a perfect blend. But when I read that passage and I saw that movie clip, I thought, this is exactly what Jesus is talking about. In order for the Pinot grape to grow, certain conditions must exist, and the gardener must be constantly working with it and nurturing it and pruning it and taking care of it so that it can fulfill its full essence. And this is what Jesus is talking about in the story. That's why connection is so important. That's why connection is so very important. If you are going to fulfill what God created you to be, then you must be connected. And the pruning process is not pleasant at times. Now, sometimes many of us are very self-aware of those things which keep us from fulfilling our full essence, right? We're not, that's a little out of control. I need to stop this, all right? But some parts of us that don't bear fruit, we're not even conscious of. And yet it's those things that drive us. My father was born very poor, very poor. His father and mother were sharecroppers in Kentucky. My father was so ashamed of where he lived and how poor his conditions were that when he got a ride home from school, he would make his friends drop him off a mile away so that he could walk home and no one could see where he lived. What's amazing about that is my dad and mom never made a lot of money, but they always had nice homes, nice cars. My father retired at age 55, not rich, but he always lived in nice places. And yet, even though he had nothing to prove to anyone, that constant nagging in his heart and soul that somehow he is not good enough and everyone looks down upon him because he is lesser than. And it stayed with him his whole life, you see? That branch in him. What could my father have done if he had found a way to work with God to cut that branch of insecurity away so that he could have fulfilled and maybe become more than what he did, you see? And that's what the gardener, that's what the parent gardener, that's what the daddy, the mama gardener does. They see the plant, they see you, the branches, and they see areas in your life that are not producing fruit and they cut it off. And areas where you're producing fruit, they nurture that so that you produce more. Life happens in certain ways, especially when you're unconscious of that which is not producing fruit in you, to put you in a life situation that makes you slow down, look up, and think, oh my God, what is happening? And what I want you to get from that reality is this. Whenever things are happening to you, they seem like bad things, because of millennia of bad theology and bad religion, and ignorance about what the text is really saying, we often think when bad things happen to us that God is what? Punishing us. No, that's not what's happening. Remember, Daddy and Mama are the gardener. And what Daddy and Mama are doing is they're seeing that part in you that's destructive. They're seeing that part in you that does not bear good things. They're seeing that part of you that needs to be cut off and set aside, so that those other parts in you can grow and to thrive, you see. So how would life be different for us whenever we're going through our challenges and we're going through our different times and even in some times of great suffering? If we were to perceive it not so much as why is this happening to me or why is God punishing me, of asking this question instead. What is there in me that needs to be cut off and set aside so that I can then thrive and I can grow? Trees, vines that produce fruit need to be cultivated. You know this to be true. The only things in life that don't need any help at all to grow are what? Weeds. So if you have the right kind of tree, it's going to produce the right kind of what? Fruit. And God is about creating spiritual fruit and not religious nuts. You hear what I'm saying? All right. So in order to make sure your conscious mind, your soul, your spirit, everything that is you, is fulfilling everything God created you to be, you must become conscious and work hard to cultivate yourself with God. Because remember, you're that Pinot grape. You got a lot of work to do. But it's not just God, it's both and. It's us and God, you see. And you do that through prayer, through meditation, through reading Scripture, through reflecting on Scripture. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Just start with those. Know those stories. Know them backwards and forwards. I could ask some of you if you could tell me this particular passage on Harry Potter and the something of Phoenix, and many of you say, oh. I want you to be that familiar with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Come to Bible study. Come and worship. Intentionally put yourself in places where people are teaching and studying and asking questions and growing together in these spiritual realities and these spiritual truths. That is your part to play in making sure that you are producing the fruit God created you to produce. And as we do that individually, as we do it collectively, then what we discover is that we, like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, will find ourselves someday sitting in the sea of tranquility and harmony with self and God and the cosmos around us. And that's where I want to be. Is that where you want to be? Are you willing to go through the cutting off process? Are you willing to go through the pruning process that the daddy or the mommy God is constantly working with? Are you willing to become that person? It's both then. We have to work with the Spirit. And when we do, then we fulfill what Jesus has commanded us to do, to produce much fruit. Thus ends the lesson. I did that in 11 minutes. I know what you're thinking now. I got a lot out of that. He should do that more often. We're going to have communion now. And for those of you who are a guest, we practice communion by intinction, which means we take the bread, we dip it into the cup, and Steve, if you'll be